Okay, we've got to talk about Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, the lovely Sean Kirkpatrick. So get in here. This is Jack with Cosmic Road. I talk about UFOs and the paranormal. Please hit like and subscribe and let me know what you think in the comments below. Okay, yeah, so Sean Kirkpatrick is making the rounds, spreading disinformation as he does. That's his gig. That's his gig, and he is not a shirker. And one of his latest claims involves the famous Bismouth piece of Metamaterial. Let's hear what he has to say.
They're some of the same people that worked for Robert Bigelow under the DIA program. They're some of the same people that have been working behind the scenes with Congress to write legislation. They're the same people that worked with a U.S. company and the United States Army to explore a piece of material that they claimed was a U.A.P, and it really is a piece of missile casing from the 1950s. They're the same people that have been influencing some of these whistleblowers who have come forward to say, hey, I don't have any firsthand evidence, but all these people are telling me.
Okay, so a missile casing from the 1950s. That was what Sean Kirkpatrick is now claiming. I love it. But Gary Nolan isn't buying it. He says, well, I personally have two pieces of it through two chains of evidence. The material is so fragile at this point, it crumbles easily. I've made burnt toast with more resilience. I don't know of any missile casing so fragile that could have survived transport and loading, never mind the acceleration of being fired. It would be dust before it left the firing tube. Both of my pieces exhibit extreme layering. So I look forward to Dr. Kirkpatrick's peer-reviewed data, as well as all the other claims he has made. Has he released any data from any of the claims? Did I miss something? I love it. Here's Gary Nolan talking about it with Ross Colart. Colart says, one of the things that's been speculated about this particular piece of bismuth magnesium is if you put a waveform through it, it will levitate. Nolan says, I have heard of this result. I have not seen it with my own eyes. Have you tried? No, Nolan says, because the waveform that they needed to put through it is terahertz waves. Colart says, and that is why Tom DeLonge in TTSA did the CRADA, the research agreement with the U.S. Army, because they're the only people who have got the terahertz transmitter that you need. Do we know whether that research is being done now? Nolan, I'm not allowed to talk about it. But yes, they are still working, apparently, on the Bismuth piece. Steve Justice also isn't buying it. The structure and composition of these materials are not from any known existing military or commercial applications, says Steve Justice. We are focusing on verifiable facts and working to develop independent scientific proof of the material's properties and attributes. And here's Hal Puthoff talking about the bismuth piece. There was a sample that was sent anonymously by a military source. He claimed that his grandfather had been involved in a crash retrieval operation and had gotten some material from it. He didn't want to identify himself, but he sent it forward for analysis. That's what it looked like. It was a multi-layered piece of material, and Linda Howell was the one who got it and began shopping it around and trying to get analysis of it. She's a really stalwart person to try to find out about this. It had layers of bismuth. I think she may have gotten that from Art Bell. I'm trying to remember my history. Correct me if I'm wrong. The size of that is less than a human hair. The layers of bismuth. They are the black areas you see through here. And then they were separated by layers of magnesium, which are the lighter areas. And so that's what the sample actually looked like. There's been a lot of controversy, a lot of discussion about this because, after all, here you see something that does look like it was in a crash. The thin lines were the bismuth lines. So what do we really know about this? The chain of custody is non-existent. The provenance is questionable. So for all we know, it could be a hoax. It could be a fraud. It could be some slag from a foundry floor of some factory. But nonetheless, it was an unusual sample, so we decided, okay, well, then we should at least take a look at it, have an open mind. Early on, Linda Howe, the researcher who had this sample given to her by Art Bell, went around to many institutions and groups to try to get some analysis. First of all, a survey of academic publications, interviews with people from organizations involved in special materials and so on, even went to archives of the national labs like Los Alamos or wherever. And nobody had any data on this kind of construction having been made. And then there was someone else she went to, and they tried to see, could they just duplicate the material? In fact, they had trouble bonding the magnesium and bismuth layers together. So it wasn't clear exactly how you would make it. And then finally, in talking to materials experts, they say, well, let's just say somebody could make this. What would you use it for? And all the material scientists said, I don't have a clue. I can't even imagine the reason for constructing something like this. However, what happens is a couple of decades go by or more, and suddenly we have our whole science of so-called metamaterials has been coming into the fore and developing kinds of stuff. And lo and behold, a paper gets published which says, it had a bismuth layer of just this size. It happened to match what we had, and it is separated by magnesium layers of about the size that we see. This would have a very special property. This came out of a metamaterial research and not directly associated with this material. So it turns out this would make a terahertz waveguide. What's a terahertz? Well, you hear about megahertz and gigahertz in the microwave spectrum, and then you hear about infrared radiation. Well, terahertz sort of lies in that no man's land as far as technology development goes. Above microwaves, above gigahertz, but less than the wavelength of infrared heat. So it turns out that ordinarily when you have a waveguide and you want to send a signal from one place to another, you have a pipe, for example, and the pipe generally has to be about the size of a wavelength and a half wavelength, for example. Well, in this case, there is a frequency band around 5 terahertz and the wavelength is a certain size. Well, it turns out in this special kind of material, those thin bismuth layers would transmit those signals at 1/20th the size of the wavelength. And so that means you now have sub-wavelength waveguide effects. So what that means is if you want to transmit a lot of data at terahertz frequencies, then usually you got to imagine a stack of waveguides to do it with. Now suddenly you've got this whole thing micro-sized down and you can carry out your task. And it's only because of metamaterials being developed. No, there were no metamaterials being developed back in the days when the sample was found, that's for sure. But anyway, so there's a possibility this has an important effect. So actually what we see here then, and this happens in many cases, you get a material sample, unusual characteristics, and you want to evaluate it. Method of manufacture is difficult to assess or reproduce, as it were. The purpose of function is not readily apparent. But then our own science advances on over the decades, and finally we get to a place where we can imagine a possible purpose or function comes to light, which was the case here. So there you go, Hal Puthoff saying this is an extremely complicated piece of material with an extremely esoteric function, at least as it pertains to modern science. So not a shell casing Sean Kirkpatrick. Apparently people in the Senate aren't buying Sean Kirkpatrick's lies either. Per a Senate source from Merrick VR, Kirkpatrick appears to be a disinformation agent. He is not being honest about what he heard from the whistleblowers that were referred. Arrow shared no info on U.A.P. whistleblowers with Congress. Speaking of whistleblowers that had a bad time at Arrow, here's one.
Dave Grush told me he's going back to D.C. sometime in the next week or so. I said, Dave, please do something for me. Tell Dr. Kirkpatrick that Dr. Jacobs says, fuck you.
Love it. Yeah, and that about sums it up. Even Stephen Greenstreet has said stuff about Sean Kirkpatrick to indicate that he is a disinfo agent. I mean, he didn't frame it that way, but here we go. Here's a tweet thread, or series of threads rather, from Stephen Greenstreet, who I might want to call the lovely Stephen Greenstreet, but it's an interesting thread because he did go out to Skinwalker Ranch and talk to Brandon Fugel and got some dirt on SK. He says, yes, that Kirkpatrick is already convinced on the reality of UFOs and has been for years. Oh, and also that he's apparently very interested in the contagious space ghosts at Skinwalker Ranch. Space ghosts. All right. Well, why not? Maybe they are space ghosts, Stephen Greenstreet. Now, of course, Stephen Greenstreet is a debunker and is mocking Skinwalker Ranch. In 2018, he says Kirkpatrick led a DC briefing with Brandon Fugel about Skinwalker Ranch. He apparently proclaimed his full belief in the UFO phenomena. The briefing contained blurry photos of white dots and analysis of spooky hitchhiker attacks. Kirkpatrick has reportedly been very into UFOs for years now. I would absolutely ask Mr. Kirkpatrick about his interest in Skinwalker Ranch. Why do you not feel that it is relevant here? Because, try as I might, a lot of this is tied to or connected to a space ghost ranch in Utah. Well, of course it is. UFO disclosure began at Skinwalker Ranch. Kirkpatrick is a total UFO guy with Skinwalker Ranch ties. Well, I don't know how much ties he had, but he did get a briefing with Brandon. Let's see. So anyway, it goes on. But there you go. Sean Kirkpatrick knows all about UFOs, and to think that he's not actually actively a disinformation agent is to totally misunderstand the lovely Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick. But let me know what you guys think in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed this video, please give me a big thumbs up. I sure appreciate it. Smash the subscribe button and the bell to be notified of future videos. You don't want to miss a thing. Join me on social media. There's Facebook and Twitter links below. Love to see you guys there. If you wanted to support Cosmic Road in an even bigger way, please consider grabbing a coffee mug or a t-shirt in the merch store below. If you wanted to support Cosmic Road in another way, you could be a channel member. Channel members are rock stars, and I really appreciate you guys' support. Also, channel members frequently get to see videos hours ahead of everybody else. Meanwhile, there are plenty of other videos on the channel, and I'll see you guys next time. This is Jack with Cosmic Road, signing out.